Our next presenter is Manasa Pagadala. I hope I pronounced that right. And Manasa is from Rivermount Collegiate School in Bettendorf, and she's the daughter of Padma and Kishore Pagadala. Anyway, her title of presentation is Switch to Switchgrass. Let's please welcome Manasa.
These days, one of the biggest issues our world is facing is energy. In fact, in recent years, according to the most optimistic of studies, most of our fossil fuels are going to run out by 2088, which means we're in a scramble to find a new, efficient energy source. If I were to look at solving the energy crisis on the global scale, we need an energy source that is easily accessible and easily manufactured. In other words, ethanol, which, compared to gasoline, releases fewer carbon emissions, preventing the onset of climate change. Now, ethanol can be produced from a variety of sources, especially here in Iowa. Corn is a big deal, to say the least. But I wanted to know if the grass is greener on the other side. So naturally, I decided to focus on switchgrass as a biomass source. So switchgrass is a native perennial grass that is very hardy, grows with little water, and is almost considered a weed in most areas of the United States and India, making its abundance perfect for ethanol production. Now, switching to switchgrass was my dream project from the very beginning. For the past 3 years, I attempted to scientifically develop the most efficient method of producing ethanol from switchgrass, and it really developed into a passion for me. I mean, everyone takes energy for granted in the United States. We use it all the time without even thinking about how the constant use of fossil fuels for energy is releasing tons and tons of carbon emissions, which is furthering climate change, one of the biggest issues in our world. And it's easy to think that change is happening, because it is, especially in Iowa. There are American policymakers like President Obama that are aware of the onset of climate change and are pushing for more ethanol and more ethanol plants all over the country. But what about a country like India? I visit India every other year, and in recent years, the air quality has only worsened as a result of excessive emissions and little to no large-scale efforts being made to remedy the issue. This whole issue can be pegged to one thing: lack of awareness. As World Food Prize recipient Per Pinstrup-Andersen once said, the first step in solving any issue is awareness. Until the public is aware of the issue, no progress can be made just yet. And that's what triggered the idea of raising awareness of biofuel production in targeted areas like India. I had 3 main objectives for this project: raising awareness for biofuel, targeting a third world country, and sending the necessary resources to organizations that could potentially take action. The process of starting my project began with developing a way to raise awareness through kits, which I thought were the perfect combination of dynamic visuals and information. This was the first step. The second step was targeting areas that would benefit the most from this. The third step was developing contacts to send the individual kits to and how that would work cost-wise. And finally, the fourth step was connecting to change makers, or people that could directly help the issue of biofuel awareness. Now, for my kits, I had to decide what was worth putting in there. And finally, after a lot of thought, I decided, what's the best way to demonstrate to people that producing ethanol from a biomass source is simple? By showing them. So I decided to assemble a sample demonstration in each kit. So in each of them, this is one of them, I included a biomass source, which in this case is switchgrass, a pretreatment enzyme, a hydrolyzing enzyme, it's called cellulase, and distiller's yeast. Now, I won't get into the gritty scientific details of all this, but adding each of these enzymes to the switchgrass in a respective order will break it down until it's fermented by the yeast to produce a small sample of ethanol to burn, as shown in a video that I originally planned on showing, but it did not work out. So let's move on. The whole purpose of this is to make people more aware of how simple and efficient ethanol production really is. Also, in addition to the demo, the most important part was the information. I included a brochure and a pamphlet with lots of information detailing how ethanol production works in a large-scale factory and why it's important to spread awareness about this. Establishing contacts was the most time-consuming aspect. It involved lots of research and communication on the phone, since email was proving to be less effective in India. I found that I wanted to target southern India, which tends to have poor air quality, and started contacting schools, environmental groups, and energy corporations to see if they wanted to learn about biofuel production. I sent kids to Kodaikanal International School, Chinmaya International School, Abhyasa Residential School, the Environmental Club of India, or the ECI, the Indian Institute of Ecology and Environment, Sirutuli, which is an energy corporation, and the list goes on forever. The reason I targeted schools was because my aunt, who lives in South India, is a high school science teacher, and informed me that schools in India have been advocating scientific demonstrations in recent years. She recommended that I send the kids to these schools to expose hands-on science to them, while teaching them about the dire issue of climate change at the same time. I sent my first kit to Kodaikanal International School, where my aunt works, in May, and after 3 weeks, I got a call from the school's headmistress, Sulochana Penumada. I thought, oh great, I got my aunt fired. But I picked up and talked to her, and she told me that the secondary school students watched the demo. I thought, okay. And she said they really loved the demonstration and the message of saving the environment, and I was overjoyed. Not to mention that she used the contact information I sent her and referred it to various school administrators she knew from being on an Indian school board. And that was really the turning point of my project. After that, I started sending kits left and right to various contacts Mrs. Penumada gave me, along with contacting countless schools I researched myself. Unfortunately, email is not very popular in India, as I mentioned before, so all my business was done through the phone. And originally, if we're going to look at numbers here, my goal in my proposal was to send 30 kits at most. And finally, I looked at the total the other day, I ended up sending 67. Now, although I accomplished my goal with the number of kits, this project had many roadblocks along the way. In my original proposal, I predicted that I would send these kits directly to Indian families that lived with a lack of energy. But then I realized after some thought that these families would most likely not understand what I was proposing, and there would be no way to stay in contact with them. This project would have no focus if I decided to do that. As a result, I decided to target educational institutions that focus on research and can actually understand the implications of this project. Another development occurred in my project when I came to the Herbert Hoover weekend back in June. I was speaking with past judges about my proposal, and one judge mentioned to me that awareness was vital, but suggested that I attempt to get a politician on my side and see what I can do about that. And I thought about that for a while and thought, why not take this project even further? So by the time August rolled around, I had sent out all my kits and fulfilled my original proposal. I'd attempted to raise awareness about biofuel, and over 60 organizations had received my kits, and most, if not all, when I called them again, had positive feedback on the change I was trying to make. And although I can't really measure awareness, I thought it was safe to say that because of my project, more students, the future generation, environmental groups, which are social groups trying to discuss worldly issues, knew about the issue of climate change and a potential solution to remedy it. I didn't expect people to jump up and start having a political revolt, although the Indian Institute of Ecology is now going to discuss climate change at their next annual meeting after I sent them a kit, but I saw fulfillment of my original proposal. Now you might ask, was I happy with my project? No, I definitely was not. Not at the time, at least. I wanted to take it a step further. So I contacted a politician, Union Minister Harsha Vardhan, whose name I got from the Center for Energy Biosciences, after sending them a kit. So I called him and spoke with him for a while on the issue of climate change, why I was passionate about it, and why it was important for India to address this issue. We had a decent, short discussion, and later he let me know about a company called Praj. According to Mr. Vardhan, since Narendra Modi, the new Prime Minister of India, announced his national biofuel policy calling for a 5% ethanol blend into gasoline, multiple international energy corporations are wanting to establish biofuel plants in India. One of them, Praj, is planning on setting up a second-generation ethanol plant in India and requested a federal grant in order to fund the project. When I talked to Mr. Vardhan, he told me that I should donate money to the project fund because I would be contributing to the development of an actual ethanol plant, and that would be using agricultural residue, including switchgrass, as biomass, which is exactly what my project is standing for. So as an addition to my original proposal, I also decided to send money for the building of the ethanol plant by raising money through grant applications. So I mentioned that this is a dream project of mine, and I actually had plans in my freshman year of high school to continue this science project. And therefore, I applied for grants to receive money to buy resources for the next part of the experiment. Therefore, I already had $3,000 of grant money along with scholarship money for the science project. And in addition to this, I also applied to 2 grants, one from the Iowa Junior Academy of Science and one from the Iowa Women's Foundation. I added a bit of my own personal funds, and the total came out to be $5,000 exactly, which, as you can see from this slide, equals roughly 3 lakh rupees, which is quite a bit in India. My first proposal that called for kits simply being sent directly to families developed into a project that established dozens of specific contacts at various institutions, sending them kits, getting an idea of the level of awareness by asking for feedback, and contributing to the development of an ethanol plant in a country where biofuel is greatly needed. This project made me establish a completely new network of people and come up with a project that I now see myself continuing in the future. Like, I know for a fact that I'm going to continue this independently until I graduate next year and continue even beyond India to target other regions of the world to spread awareness. In addition to fulfilling my 3 original objectives for this project, I was also surprised to see how it developed from a hypothetical, more awareness-based project to actually include hands-on direct involvement in creating ethanol on a large scale, which is projected to save tons of carbon dioxide from being released into the air. In retrospect, I realized how much of Herbert Hoover's values are reflected in this project. Hoover was a conservationist who believed greatly in preserving the world which we live in, which is the central idea of preventing climate change. At certain points during my project, I also began to question the areas I was targeting to spread awareness. Why did I have to go as far as India? Why not just spread awareness in the US and save me the hassle of going to a foreign country? I then remembered hearing about how much Herbert Hoover's involvement in Europe during the war helped their countries rebuild and their people recover. Help is needed everywhere, and I now take pride in the fact that I decided to branch out of my community to a global scale. Maybe fossil fuels will run out in 2088, but I have confidence that my small contribution to raising awareness of this issue will help others develop the proper solution in the end. Thank you.
I wish I knew more about this. How does, you don't burn the switchgrass, do you?
No.
It's decomposed, and in the decomposition, ethanol is produced. How do you capture the ethanol?
Okay, so I know I mentioned in my presentation I won't get into the gritty scientific details, but now I want to, so let's get into it. So as I mentioned, there's a pretreatment enzyme, a hydrolyzing enzyme, and yeast. So if you look at the basic structure of switchgrass, it's composed of 3 polymers. Lignin, which is kind of like a plant cell wall, hemicellulose, and cellulose. And the most important part of switchgrass is the cellulose. That's where all the energy that it creates in biofuel comes from. So when you add a pretreatment enzyme to that, it kind of disassociates the cellulose from the rest of the polymers. And when you add the hydrolyzing enzyme, called cellulase, it breaks down that cellulose from the previous step into individual glucose units. And some of you, I don't know if I should say this, but alcohol drinkers out there, you guys know that when you add yeast to sugar, what does that create? Alcohol. That's right. Or in this case, ethanol. So basically, after putting it through those scientific processes and fermenting it, you will get a liquid product of ethyl alcohol.
And then that has to be captured then somehow and stored.
Right, but in the process of adding the enzymes, and you add water when you add enzymes, I detailed that in my kit, you get a liquid solution in the end, which is flammable, or it's ethanol in the end.
Okay.
Did I explain that?
No, I could probably explain it. No. Thank you.
Thank you.
It seems to me that India should have well known about the use of switchgrass.
Mm-hmm.
And are you suggesting, the impression I got from your presentation is that they weren't up to speed on that. Is that true?
I think it's true to some extent. I'm not going to be that person that says India is nowhere as developed as we are, because that's not true. They do have some technological advancements in the past few years. But if we're looking at utilizing switchgrass for biofuel production, I would say that they're not aware of that. They are aware that switchgrass does exist, but they're not aware of the potential that it has as a biomass source or to produce ethanol from that biomass.
Okay, now they haven't chosen to use switchgrass in the United States. They've chosen to use grain. What is your feeling about India and their new ethanol plant? Aren't they likely to follow the economic route taken by the U.S.?
Well, if we think about the kind of crops that are grown in the United States and India, well, here in the United States, we have a surplus of corn, right? Like I talked about corn in the Midwest, huge source of biomass. But in India, that has a hotter climate, it's got different soil conditions, they actually grow switchgrass in surplus. And as I mentioned, it's kind of considered a weed in those areas. And that's why the Proj ethanol plant that I was looking into is looking at agricultural residue, including switchgrass as a biomass source, you know?
Are you aware of any research around the ability to produce enough switchgrass to produce enough ethanol to support the efforts?
Yeah, so when I was doing my scientific aspect of this project, I had to do a lot of background research, and I noticed that when we're talking about switchgrass as a biomass in comparison to other potential biomass sources, there's so much of it, and it's in great abundance. And unlike corn, which we need for food, we need for a lot of different things, feedstock, you know, all those important things, switchgrass really has no value besides that. It's not going to be part of the food industry as well. So that's really important to consider when you're having a biomass source, if it's in abundance, and is it important to any other industries besides biofuel. And in this case, it's not, so yeah.
And are you, through the research that you did, are there really any downsides to doing this? I know locally here there's switchgrass that provides habitat for, it's used in set-aside acreages and things like that. Did you find any downsides to the use of switchgrass for ethanol production?
I think maybe the biggest downside I would say is how few people actually know that switchgrass is a potential biomass source. I think it's just a lack of awareness, which this entire project is about, is kind of the biggest problem. Because unless you teach people that this is a real solution, they're not going to believe you. And it's kind of difficult to progress if nobody's willing to accept it, you know. So, yeah.
I know you have an example of the kit that you use in your project. So 2 questions. First question is, do you just mail the kit to someone in India? Kind of like, how does it get there? How do you make sure that it gets there? And then second question is, if it's going to like one of the schools you mentioned, if it's a school of like over 100, does that impact the number of kits that you send, or is it just one kit kind of per organization?
So that's a really awesome question. I was hoping somebody would ask that. So when it comes to sending the kits, I actually had family members transport them over for me. Because I feel like this is like an Indian family thing, but whenever we know that a family member is going overseas, we ask them to take things over for us. So at the time my uncle was heading overseas, I was like, I have 2 boxes full of kits, and I kind of need help carrying them over, because mailing them, oh gosh, I don't know how much that would cost, and I was trying to minimize, you know, how much money this project would cost. So it was through a relative heading overseas for the first question. And secondly, for organizations that had multiple people, I sent out kits based on how many people there were. So I mentioned that I contacted them before I would send them over. And so I would ask them, okay, how many students do you have? What's kind of the, you know, how many do you want? And so they would be like, oh, we have 100 kids, we want 2, you know. Or some people had like 50 kids, so I would just send 1 and have them kind of all gather to see it at the same time.
So I'm wondering about the rationale behind sending these kits to schools or families. is it that they're going to see how this can create ethanol and then somehow undertake to do that themselves? Or is it simply that you want them to agitate in their country, lobby in their country for this as a solution, or both? What's your thoughts about, in terms of the people who actually received this, what do they do with it after they've done the experiment that you gave them?
Probably the latter more than the former. I think that I definitely wanted them to just be aware of how simple it can be to produce ethanol. I mean, I feel like people have this pre-existing notion that ethanol requires a million different enzymes and it takes so much time and it's so energy intensive, when you can produce it just from a simple kit. That's kind of the idea I wanted to get across, firstly. And then the second idea was, I kind of want to have them know this and try to spread it to as many people as possible. So I did mention that I added brochures and multiple pamphlets along with the kit. So those were all going to detail how they could, you know, help me out a little bit by spreading awareness by themselves, you know, giving me contacts to other organizations or giving me feedback, which helps me know what I can do to increase awareness even more. And even them, they could join an environmental group in India, which I did mention in one of my brochures, which would, you know, help the issue progress and, you know, solve it even nicer. Yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.